Hello, friends. Here I am today with a new podcast, and it is, um, I would not use the word interesting because this podcast is on a very sensitive topic, a topic which I want to learn about, which I want to know more about, a topic which is propagated negatively in my part of the world, and there are so many unfortunate conspiracies which uh, people used to attach with this topic. Yes, the topic is Holocaust. uh, I have not read much about it. I never met a person who suffered from Holocaust or a family which has gone through the Holocaust. But today my guest is a friend who met with so many people who have gone through this whole episode of burning souls, this whole episode of trauma. And we need to realize that it is now a part of national psychology of Jews. So we have to, we should, we must respect it. We must respect their emotions, and that is the way to let them understand our emotions. So the respect is a mutual channel. So coming back to the topic and introducing my guest with you, it is uh, Dr. David Doche. He is from Yad Vashem Museum, and Dr. David is working on Holocaust in his museum for long time. I welcome you, Dr. David. Thanks for
Thank you.
sparing your time for us.
Thank you, Pierre. Thank you so much.
And I'm sorry if I could not introduce the topic in a proper way, because I said we know a little about it, so we don't know the sensitivities of the topic and how to present it. But this is what we want to learn from you, and we want to know uh, from you. So let's begin with. I'm sorry, Dr. David. I know this is not a pleasant topic to discuss. I know
Mhm.
this. I have so many Jewish friends. I know whenever we talk about Holocaust, uh, they feel the burns. They feel uh, because they are from the community of victims. They have gone through this pain, and they know the pain. They know they still feel the wounds. So I know this is not a pleasant topic to discuss, but uh, who better teach us about this than you? So we know that Holocaust was kind of genocide,
Mhm. Yeah.
uh, but we don't know why it took place.
Mm. Um, First of all, Pierre, thank you for the opportunity. And I think you hit a very important note when you said, wait, I don't know how to present this. I don't know. And the inability to know how to present such a story hits something very universal to each one of us. And that is, how do we talk about trauma? How do we talk about that thing that we cannot talk about? How do we, as a people, address those aspects in our histories that any word that we say about it would undermine it? And that is something very universal, because I think many other nations have national traumas, the same way people have traumas. Now, in a way, when I say, how do we talk about the Holocaust, and you being puzzled and me being puzzled as well, I think is a very modest way to begin the story with, When I teach my students the Holocaust, I begin with, I do not know how to teach this. I am struggling with you because I don't think there's a way to look directly into the abyss, into the evil, into the fact that 6 million Jews were murdered, innocent people, over almost close to 500,000 Roma. There were close to 250,000 in T4 operation. I continue on with these Nazi killings. How can one look into that and yet stay sane? This is not a question I raise. This is a question that Zalman Gradovsky, one of the people that died in Auschwitz, and he worked in burning of the bodies, he says, if you even know about what happened here, you won't be able to be sane. So I think your introductory comment of creating the correct approach, one with humility and one with awe, and one with the understanding that we will not be able in this talk to fully understand what took place there. And I think understanding that is a substantial and a significant introduction into the topic, and it also enables a dialogue about the topic, not a competition of victimization, but rather a dialogue of how do we tell a story that we cannot tell. And when you ask the question, why did it happen? I think I would broaden that question even greater. After the Holocaust, there was a saying, never again. 6 million Jews had been killed in the Nazi killing machine and other minorities as well. However, despite the world that established the UN and had a commission that dealt with genocide crimes and international court tribunals, etc., later on there were genocides that took place. In other words, the question should be, how is it that in the 20th century, human rights were violated so gruesomely, all over in different forms and shapes? This question you're asking goes far deeper than the question only of anti-Semitism and the Jews. It's a broader question of why is it that despite of all the progress we made as a human race, violent racism is so rooted in the way we deal with other people? That's a very serious question. And again, I don't have a full answer. Maybe this podcast will be a podcast of questions, which is just as good. So that's my comment about the introduction to the topic and the way I see us talking about it together.
And Dr. David, 6 million people. So millions and millions of families. I guess Jewish community is a small community now. They're hardly,
Yes.
If I'm not wrong, 14 million people.
Well, it depends. In Israel, we're talking about, we're getting close to the same number we were. However, I think that only lately we're reaching that number of about 18 million Jews that were before the war. So from 18, it went down to 12, although, you can't really count this as a minority because the numbers shift depending on the category. But generally speaking, yes, up until today, we're still working up to the number we were.
You rightly said, we cannot describe the trauma. It's hard to understand the trauma. And how can someone burn a community? Push them to gas chambers? Kill them in millions? How can one? And still, and this was a complete human disaster. This was a complete human disaster. Did you ever meet a person who have gone through Holocaust? I believe in this time.
Yes, actually, 3 out of my 4 grandparents.
Okay.
And so usually I think Israelis and Jews in general at this point have it in their families. Actually, my grandfather passed away a couple of weeks ago. He was from a place called Linish. It's a small town between Düsseldorf and Köln. His father was the head the deputy of the Democratic Party in that small city. And my grandfather fled to France after Kristallnacht, after November 1938, because he saw that things were getting bad. He was about 12 years old. And from there, he fled to the US. We have a few letters between him and his parents up until 1941. And after 1941, they were sent off to the East, and we have no more recollection of them. We assume they were killed throughout the end of 1941, beginning of 1942. So that's, and my other grandfather is from Slovakia. He lost, out of 12 brothers and sisters, he was left with one sister after the war. So for us, the story of the Holocaust is intimate. It's part of our biographies. It's part of our not only national narrative, but also self-identity process. It's part of our history. The same way, as I said, for South Africans, for example, my colleagues from South Africa, for them, apartheid is not just a story of history. It's something that creates waves for the relationships between them and their parents, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm saying that the Holocaust is evident in our building of subjective identities in Israel and abroad. It's as recent as that.
Dr. David, do you think that this whole Holocaust and this whole suffering pushed the Jewish community to struggle more for an independent Jewish country?
That's a very good question. First of all, to be fully honest, it's not my field of expertise, but the aspirations for a Jewish state are before the Holocaust. They're part of a general European movement of nationalism. And within those European minorities, and they were other minorities that were aspiring to achieve their independence, the Jews were part of that process. And that's why we see from the beginning of the 20th century these attempts to resettle Palestine then, and there were attempts to go to other places as well. I think that is part of a national movement. It is true that after the Holocaust, the understanding that there's an urgency to have a Jewish state grew. There is truth to that, especially due to the fact that the outcome was so gruesome. However, I wouldn't link it as a linear and one-sided link to the Holocaust, because the Zionist movement was there before and the conflict was there before the Holocaust.
That's right. And I guess after the Holocaust, the movement got more pace, and the need was advocated more peacefully for a Jewish state. And still, I don't think that people are sleeping with a peace of mind in Israel till date. Still, they have bankers in their homes, they have threats, they have attacks, they have wars, they had wars, and still they are fighting for this security after a century. It's a century long story where they are still trying to reclaim peace, security, prosperity for their community.
This is true. I think that maybe if I use Walter Benjamin's approach and sort of go a bit higher up and look at history from above, I would say I really hope that in the Middle East it wouldn't take us as long as it took Europe to reach peace, because that would be about close to 1,000 years. I hope they reach that earlier than that. However, when you look at the what is called macro kind of trajectories, there are these processes take time, especially in a multi-ethnic environment. And in many areas of the world where there are multi-ethnic communities, there are conflicts that derive of that. Sometimes they're around land, sometimes they're around culture, sometimes these are intertwined. I carry great hope. However, as I said, when I look at it a bit from above and try not to sort of take sides, I think that these processes take time, and actually, I'm hopeful. Despite sometimes what is seen from the outside, I believe that younger generations, and with the influence of the globalization, have a broader and a more, I would say, comprehensive understanding. They're more aware of information. They're able to be more critical. So I do carry some hope about the future. However, as I said, these processes take time, as we can all see.
Yeah, you're right. So, Dr. David, would you like to share some of your stories which you have heard directly from the Holocaust survivors or from their family? By the way, I wanted to ask you, still there are Holocaust survivors living on Earth? Because now there will
Yes,
be
yes, there are
many.
many. There's about 20,000
Oh, 20,000.
in Israel,
Okay.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, depends, the categories shift, but yeah, there are many living in Israel and that give their testimonies till this day,
Okay.
yes.
Okay. Would you like to share those testimonies or some of those testimonies with us, or the finding of the testimonies with us?
Absolutely, yes. And the truth is, I wanted to share testimonies that have to do with belief. That's also what we've discussed before, because many of these victims were religious Jews, were devout, believed in God. And one of my researches was, how did they carry out their belief under those conditions? Did they pray the same prayers, or did their prayer change? What way they approach God under those conditions? And I think that one of the things I found is that people's beliefs becomes more, I wouldn't say flexible, but it shifts, it adapts to their reality. And I want to, is it okay to put on a testimony of about 3 minutes, something like
Yeah, sure.
that?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I want to share you a testimony, and it will be 3 minutes, and you can hear it and also see it. And the woman's name is Manya Kay, and I'll tell you just a bit about her. She is talking about the fact that she is stripped naked in Auschwitz because they used to take off their clothing and check if they are healthy enough. They would check their bottom and check if they have flesh there, and if they do not, they would kill them. And sometimes they would do it to check that they're healthy, or check they have no fleas, etc., etc. Sometimes they would strip them naked right before they would kill them. Um, and she talks about her, now she's a religious woman. She talks about her experience, but she also, at the end, when she's stripped naked, standing in front of these Nazis, she talks about the prayer she had. Now, I will ask you, listeners, think, what would she pray in those conditions? What would she ask God under those conditions when she's humiliated and naked and has no hope? So what does she ask for? What does salvation mean for this woman? Those are the questions that interested me. And I ask you, please, to look at this and listen to this testimony without judging it, just listening to it. I'll also share my screen and the sound.
And it happened in the winter time. We were chased out of the block. We had to undress naked. It was snow, ice, cold. There was like I don't know how to describe you, a big round dish, whatever it was huge, like a small pool. We had to dip in that solution to disinfect, to get rid of the ice, of the lice. It was bitter cold. The SS was standing around the women and the men with the dogs. They took pictures and they made fun. I felt so degraded. I felt so humiliated. I was praying that the end of the world should come. I was praying that if there is God, because at that point of my life I had doubts. So I was praying, if there is a God, He should show something, a sign, a miracle. But I wasn't praying to be liberated. I was praying that a hole in the ground should open and everybody should sink in. That was such a degradation. That was such a undescribable humiliation. You stand naked, you cold, you hungry, and they're standing, they're petting their dogs, they're smoking cigarettes, and they're laughing. There isn't any worse thing what can happen to a human being. Absolutely nothing. So that was my prayer. That was my daily prayer, really. I knew that I lost everybody. Nobody is alive.
And the reason I brought this testimony, which you've all heard, is that she even notices that her prayer is different. She says, I wasn't praying to be liberated. I was praying that there will be a hole in the ground and everyone should be sucked in. She still believes in God. She's still praying. She's still having a dialogue with God. But she can't have the same dialogue she had before. The dialogue she has now, as she says, are with doubts. And one of the things that you could notice in these testimonies, that despite the conditions that she's saying that are horrific, she still keeps a form of a dialogue, of a prayer, of an infrontness of the divine. And even one of the prisoners says it, in her words, she says, God had no right to ask it from us. We did it for ourselves. It's one of the different, but she still believes. She still has a dialogue. And it's very interesting to see that even in these conditions, they change their dialogue with God, but they still keep it into a certain degree.
So painful. So painful. I just cannot imagine what she has gone through. And she is living now in Israel?
She passed away a few years ago, but yeah, she lived in Israel, yeah. She lived, she moved. She lived in the States for a while. This interview was done in the States.
Okay.
I brought you on purpose interviews in English because we have also many of them also in Hebrew.
Okay. And this is the trauma which 6 million people have gone through. More than 6 million. 6 million died. And
yeah,
who lived with the trauma were more than that.
Yes, it's true. They lived with the trauma. They tried to carry on. They tried to establish families to the degree they could. And everyone really has a different story. This is her story, but really everyone had his own or her own miracle or set of circumstances that enabled them to survive. But they all carry some form of traumatic experience.
Just speechless, Dr. David. I'm just speechless. How could someone be so cruel?
There's a rabbi that's a Holocaust survivor. He said, the reason why humans could be so cruel is because they could be so good. They don't really have a middle. That was his approach. But I think there's a bit of a, actually my PhD deals exactly with that question. How could humans do it? What is the process? And I think there are a few very important elements we should notice in this story. One element is the way we speak, our language. How do we speak about other groups? Do we generalize? Do we see a group as having a category? Do we use verbs towards groups? This group does this like this and this. And I think that's a very dangerous slope. That's one thing. And the other thing, sadly so, is not questioning, obedience, following everyone, accepting something as okay because other people do. And I know this sounds simplistic, but to be honest, if you look at most of the people behind the guns that actually shoot or actually do, their main reasoning is this is what the rest did. That's the main reasoning you see. Boots on the ground, you see a lot of the reasoning has to do with, it's not obedience, it's more conformity, the need to be part of a group, the need to have meaning, things like that. So these are usually the motivations that people have. Usually it's not this ideological, it's driven originally from ideology, but the actual people killing, usually when they acknowledge why and how they killed, they usually give a different set of motivations, which are, for example, the rest of my team did it. I didn't want to look like a coward, etc., etc. So it's maybe tells us much about ourselves, but these are the two main reasonings: language and sort of joining the herd and finding meaning in being part of the group.
And how long this whole took place? It was for years in Germany.
Okay, so maybe we'll clarify a bit of
Yeah.
history. In 19, maybe we'll do this in like speed historical explanation. In 1933, Hitler comes to power and he begins with racial laws for almost 6 years until 1939. And to be honest, these racial laws apply to Jews, to Roma, to other minorities. But 39, as he invades Poland, there's an attempt to start colonizing Europe. And as part of that attempt, he wanted to restructure Europe racially. That was his idea. From 39 to 41, there is no mass murder of Jews, but Jews are put into separate areas, which are called ghettos. But in 1941, when Hitler and Nazi Germany take it a step further and they invade the Soviet Union, then there are 4 shooting units that follow the army units, and that under the directive of killing ideological enemies, they shoot at the beginning men, and after June 41, and after a couple of months, women and children as well. There was a development. And by October 1941, the directive is to kill every man, woman, and Jewish child in the occupied areas of the Soviet Union. Meaning, right after the army, these shooting units go town after town, collect the Jews, and shoot them. This happens for almost a year, from mid 41 to mid 42. Over 1.5 million Jews were killed this way. Not only Jews, also have to add Roma, and mentally ill patients were also killed in this way. They went into hospitals, into mentally ill patient hospitals, and shot everyone there. They went into Jewish towns, took out the men, women, and children, and in batches killed them. And they did that also to Roma, which are wrongfully called gypsies, but I will call them Roma. So that's what we see until 42. And in 1942, they make a sort of this mechanism of murder. And the mechanism of murder is that they take the Jews from the towns they're in and they bring them into one of 6 killing centers. And in this method, they kill close to 4.5 million Jews, but also other minorities as well. But this was mainly focused on Jews. We could talk about close to 300,000 Roma that were killed this way. We could talk about 200,000 sort of mentally ill patients and whom Nazis defined as unworthy, also as part of that killing. But generally speaking, the majority of the murders were Jewish. And in 1945, when they saw they were losing, they took these camp prisoners, all of them Jews and non-Jews, and started marching them back into Germany. Out of 700,000 people marching back, half died on the way, 350,000. So we see 3 methods of mass murder, or 4. Starvation, 39 to 41. One that year for a year shooting, 42 to 44 end would be gas chambers and crematoriums, and at the end it would be a method of death marches. So that's sort of the story of the murders, amounting to approximately 6 million Jews, 4.8 million names that we have. That's really, in a nutshell, the story of the Holocaust, really so people have the historical context.
And the community fled at that time from Germany and other areas towards America and.
That's an excellent question. That's a very good question, because it talks about issues that we have today. They tried flee. From 33 to 39, there are racial laws in Germany, so Jews in Germany and around are trying to flee, but there's no country to accept them. There's an image about Jews maybe that they're rich, which is absolutely untrue, because the reason why countries didn't want to take on Jewish immigrants, because many of these Jewish immigrants were poor, right? So no one wants poor immigrants. Let's talk about the US for a second. The US had an Immigration Act from 1924 that said that it doesn't want South Europeans and it doesn't want Jews. And all around the world, the immigration laws were racial immigration laws, excluding, by the way, not only Jews, other minorities as well. We were not alone. But I'm saying this because of the fact that you're saying, why didn't they escape or why didn't they leave? They had nowhere to leave to. They didn't have visas to anywhere. There were very few countries around the world that would accept refugees at the time. So that is the reason why many of them had to stay behind.
And which countries were there to accept Jews at that time?
Dominican Republic accepted Jews. Also, the U.S. accepted. There were quotas. Many countries. Palestine then had a quota of about 10,000 a year, depending on the time. So there were quotas all around the world, but there was no country that would accept the masses of refugees that would come. And also, we could see the same dynamic happening today. In refugees numbers go not into the tens of thousands, but to the hundreds of thousands. Countries close their doors off because they make their self-preservation interest kind of calculation. But add to that another aspect, that they were limiting even more certain minorities. This is important to remember. For Jews, Southern Europeans, Roma, for all those minorities that were targeted in Europe, it was even harder. So it's two things together. It's generally these limitations on immigration, and the second thing would be racial targeting of certain minorities.
And was there any post-trauma program or treatment which was there for the community at that time?
I think that that's a very good question, and sadly the answer is very much no. Most of these traumatic experiences, and this is part of the dynamics of genocide generally, also in Cambodia and also in Rwanda, and the fact that it doesn't end the day the war ends. And not only that, I could tell you about those survivors that went to the US. They kept their stories to themselves because they didn't want to feel different. I asked my grandfather himself, why didn't he tell his story? He told me he wanted to be normal. He didn't want anyone to know. Same goes for my grandmother. They all kept their stories in their stomachs because, until this day, think about it, of victims of other forms of violence. There's shame. And this is something I would really like to expose here. And that the victims always say, they have like these sensitivities that they know that their stories will be too crazy, too violent for anyone to listen to. Primo Levi says that. And I want to add this story. He says, Primo Levi is a survivor from Auschwitz. And he said that the camp prisoners had a recurring dream in the camp itself, a nightmare. And I was thinking to myself, wait, what could be a nightmare of a person that his family's already dead? He's working and burning the bodies of other Jews. He doesn't have any hope. The Nazis made them do that. So what could be a nightmare of such a prisoner, of such a person? What could be worse than his reality? And he says The nightmare that they had was that they go back home and they tell their story. And he says, not only do people not believe, they don't even listen. They can't hear it. So their nightmare is that their stories won't be heard. It's not a nightmare that they suffer after the war. This is a nightmare they're having in Auschwitz itself. The need to be listened to. And the fact that they were not, because they knew that their stories are too violent or too much for people to listen to. It's too heavy, quote unquote, so to speak. When they arrived in Israel, for example, that was even worse. And Israel changed in that respect. They were seen as weak because they were seen as sheep to slaughter. They were considered second best. Why didn't you fight? People asked them, accusing them of their victimization. Today it changed. Today in Israel, we try to really respect and even admire these survivors, but it wasn't like this all the time. It changed around the 60s and 70s. The discourse changed. But to answer your question, the fear of not being listened to, the fear of not being heard, which is a universal fear that victims have, was there in the camps, was there after the camps, was a reality they had to suffer with. And despite all of that, they established families, communities. I'm a grandson of 3 out of 4 Holocaust survivors. So I'm saying that this is something that always, for me, inspired me. The fact that despite all of what they went through, the inability to tell their stories, the trauma and the silencing, they still were able to fight for life. And that is something that I find very admirable and inspirational about their biographies.
That's true. And it is surprising for me that they were not treated normally in Israel for decades and decades. Because as my understanding is that if Israel is a Jewish country, and the Jews who suffered from the trauma of Holocaust and survived Holocaust and took refuge to a Jewish country, that's again kind of mishandling with the whole survivor community, that they were not properly taken care of. It was more a shock which was waiting for them in Israel. Because I am Pakistani. I have gone through so many stories of partition when people suffered from catastrophic situation and they migrated from one part of land to a new born country. And when they reached to that country, they were there without families, without their wealth, without their homes, without their jobs. And they were hoping the population of new country, native population of new country, to receive them with open arms, to understand what they have gone through. And so I can relate it very well, that it was again a hard time which they have faced for decades. So coming back,
I think partition is a very good example that you're giving, because it actually deals with the question, how do we tell our stories?
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
And your museum, let's explore it a little bit. What actually your museum is doing?
The Yad Vashem Museum, what it tries to do, it tries to give visitors an overview with a visit of about 2 hours, walking through it, of the story of the Holocaust in historical context. It's built as a strong educational element. And it tries to tell the story of the Holocaust. The thing is that every museum is actually a story, like a history book. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has a narrative. And maybe I should say a bit about the narrative of our museum. The narrative of the museum at Yad Vashem is to tell the story of the Holocaust through the eyes of the victims. That's the idea. That's why the beginning of the museum is not about death. The first part of the museum is about Jewish life before the war, showing that Jews were a European nation, minority, indeed in Europe, but a European minority. There were in the middle and east and west, if you take them together, there's almost 9 to 10 million Jews in those areas. The same way the Roma are a European minority. The same way Europe has an ethnic majority and minorities in it. So we begin the story with the victims themselves, not with, we have a tendency to tell stories of violence from the moment that it happened. Teaching Partition from 1948, right? But in order to understand, we have to go back and forward. So that's what we do. We go back to Jewish life before the war. And then we begin with the story of the Holocaust. And when we tell the story of the Holocaust, this museum had a new thought. It said, why are we only focusing on Nazi photographs and on Nazi documents? So it tries to tell the story through art, through music, through Jewish testimonies, through diaries, through and to sort of restructure the story, not only to tell what the Germans had done to the Jews, but to ask, how did the Jews respond in those conditions? For example, the testimony I've just brought you. I could have shown you a picture, right, of Germans, putting Jews naked, but I didn't do that. I said, I want you to hear a voice of a person talking about it and her belief and her talk with God in that reality. And this is the idea of the museum, to retell the story of violence, of the Holocaust, through the eyes of the victims. That's why throughout the museum, when we show perpetrators, Nazis, they're put into these small black boxes. They're artistically separated from the rest. And the museum also the end of the museum ends with the Hall of Names, which is where we remember 4.8 million Jews that perished, and we acknowledge the 6 million. And again, the idea, and it also opens into a forest. And the idea is memory and life. Those are the endings of the museum, that it ends into our memory of those who had been murdered, and future life of that despite the story of death, which is the story of the Holocaust, there is a sort of a theme that relates to life and relates to growth. So that is more or less the theme of the museum. And also the main thing is to, again, try to tell the story of the Holocaust, focusing on the Jewish testimony, focusing on the victim's testimony.
Thank you, Dr. David. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing and educating us about Holocaust. A very sensitive subject.
Thank you.
And I'm sure one day we will sit again and we will discuss it more. My thoughts and prayers are not only with the victims of Holocaust or survivor of the Holocaust, but with everyone who feels and relates with the pain of survivor and victims of Holocaust. So I guess it is time to understand enough is enough. We all, 7 billion people, we have an equal right of peace, liberty, peace of mind, peace of soul, prosperity. We all equally have the right, and we should enjoy it. And now, I guess, as before this podcast, pre-podcast discussion, I was sharing with you that humankind should learn it, that war is not a solution of anything. It is a trouble problem. So peace is the ultimate solution we all should go for.
I can't agree with that more. Yes. I will take your words, both of the statements and also in light of what Maniake said, as a prayer.
Yeah, true. So thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for
having me. It's a great privilege to be here.
Take care. Goodbye.